Tonight, I'm presenting on understanding or trying to understand the commodity. I did a presentation kind of like on commodity fetishism a while ago, and I went back and watched it, and it was pretty terrible. So I kind of wanted to come back and maybe, I don't know, focus more on just this first section of Capital, the first chapter of Capital, which I think explains the commodity fetish at the end. And we kind of have to develop an understanding of the commodity first. So yeah, I got sucked into a Capital reading group years ago, and that's really what got me questioning anarchism, and really sent me on a kind of a journey of reading a lot of Marxist texts. I think Capital is really dense and it's really long, but it's very brilliant, and I think it's one of the best arguments made for communism. But it's really done by just rigorously critiquing capitalism. So yeah, I guess we'll just start with the first line of Capital. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation therefore begins with analysis of the commodity. So yeah, Marx, I think he had made multiple drafts trying to develop like an analysis of capitalism, and he finally started by, he came to the commodity as kind of the fundamental structuring form of capitalism. It's the core. From which he kind of proceeded to unwrap other social categories and forms, like money, capital, prices. The commodity was his starting point. So even in this first sentence, it's kind of good to pay attention to Marx's language. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. Marx is suggesting there that the wealth of society could appear as something else, that commodities have not been the wealth of every society in human history. So I guess we want to ask the question, what is the commodity? A commodity is an item produced for exchange on the market. It contains two different types of value. And I like this Marx quote. We're going to start by talking about use value. The commodity is, first of all, an external object, an item which, through its qualities, satisfies human needs of whatever kind, I believe it says. The nature of these needs, whether they arise from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference. So yeah, use value is, simply put, it's the utility of an object. It's how it can be used to satisfy human need. And so this can be food or water to help us subsist, but also a book for stimulation or tools to produce more items. But the commodity, while it contains a use value, it also contains another type of value, which is exchange value. And it appears, first of all, as the quantitative relation, the proportion in which use values of one kind exchange for use values of another kind. So we look at this equation, 20 yards of linen equals one coat. This is kind of a famous formula for Marx. And he actually doesn't start with this. He starts with, I think, corn and iron, but it really doesn't make a difference. It's kind of strange to look at. When we think of capitalism, we think of, money being a big part of it, where a capitalist produces a commodity, sells it, and then buys other commodities. And not a capitalist, just a producer in this situation, because we haven't really gotten to capital yet. So what Marx is doing here is he's analyzing the commodity in abstraction from value. He's just looking at the commodity form by itself. By just saying that the commodity is a use value on one hand and that we exchange it for money on the other hand, doesn't get us much further past like a surface understanding of what the commodity is. And this kind of makes more sense as the investigation unfolds. But here, Marx starts with the isolated exchange, two people exchanging two items. These items are considered equal in this act of exchange, but what is it that makes them equal is a pretty important question to ask here. You can't make a coat from 20 yards of linen. You can't make 20 yards of linen from a coat. So what is the substance that makes them equal? So I'll hit you with a quote. As use values, commodities differ above all in quality, while as exchange values, they can only differ in quantity, and therefore do not contain an atom of use value. Only one property remains, that of being products of labor. So this is where Marx develops, he develops the labor theory of value, but the labor theory of value was actually discovered by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. But it's pretty simple. It's the theory that the value of a commodity is determined by how much human labor time has been expended in producing it, how much time one spends producing a commodity. The more labor time, the more value. The less labor time, less value. And so, like I said, Smith and Ricardo had developed this theory before Marx. The way they investigated it was from the standpoint of an individual laborer, kind of assuming his actions as rational and natural. And they kind of took this form of labor as just like the true form of labor all throughout history. Marx was different. He was investigating the social totality and the social relations which make up that totality. He was critiquing labor itself, which was specific to capitalism. And some people say, I see that, like, some people say that he built on Ricardo and Smith's theories. I think it's better to look at it as him critiquing them. So with the disappearance of the useful character of the products of labor, the useful character of the kinds of labor embodied in them also disappears. This in turn entails the disappearance of the different forms of concrete forms of labor. They can no longer be distinguished, but are altogether reduced to the same kind of labor, human labor in the abstract. So this is abstract labor. This is how we understand the dual character of the commodity and the dual character of labor that produces it. We have concrete labor and abstract labor. The concrete dimension produces use value, while the abstract dimension produces exchange value. Now, with the generalization of commodity production, which is a precondition for capitalism, labor now appears as one homogeneous process. So weaving, carpentry, mining, fishing are all now reduced to equal human labor. And the particular concrete methods used to produce an item, they're abstracted away from, and items are bought based on how much equal human labor is contained in them. It's also interesting to look, it's important to look at the total labor of society and how this affects it. We can look at the whole as a bunch of different kind of particular types of labor and commodities. But with abstract labor and exchange value, all that is reduced to one homogeneous kind of singular mass. So that's kind of how we understand abstract labor. This is the twofold character of labor. Abstract labor equals exchange value. Concrete labor creates use value. Concrete labor and use value are kind of how labor has existed all throughout history. It's simply us creating things to use or consume. What's unique to labor under capitalism is this abstract dimension. So socially necessary labor time, another very important thing to understand. So once again, we're looking at a society where commodities are produced and exchanged by private individuals on the market. In general, this is the dominant form of production. When we look back at an earlier society with like an isolated active exchange, the two parties, this was a much more negotiated kind of interaction. The terms on which they agreed were more based on like a mutual agreement, and the terms were much more flexible. With generalized commodity production, it's not just private labor by itself that gives an item value. So you can't just work slower and expect an item to contain more value. With when commodity production becomes dominant, socially necessary labor time, this emerges as a temporal norm, which is basically a time requirement that producers have to conform to. It represents the average time taken to produce a commodity in a given period, given a certain period of capitalism, given all the average technological advances, all the knowledge, the average. It's the average time taken to produce that commodity. And that changes all throughout history, obviously. So value represents how much socially necessary labor time is expended in production. So considering this, commodities confront us on the market already stamped with an objective value and also a price. And that's actually something different from value in Marx's analysis, and it's not something we're going to cover. We can talk about it in the discussion if anyone's interested. So we can imagine kind of a situation where the same commodity is being produced by multiple private producers. Given that they all have similar levels of productivity, their commodities assume an average value, which represents socially necessary labor time. But if one producer develops a significantly more advanced technology or skills of production, they can produce the commodity using less labor time and sell it more cheaply, and thereby they can gain control of the market. All the other producers of this commodity are now forced to adapt the same methods, and the socially necessary labor time is reduced. And now, if anyone wants to also enter, now if any new producers want to produce this commodity, they also have to conform to this socially necessary labor time. So another important thing to understand with commodity production is the social division of labor. Division of labor is a necessary condition for commodity production, although the converse does not hold. Commodity production is not a necessary condition for the social division of labor. So the division of labor has existed all throughout human history. It's not unique to capitalism. It's I think, an expression of human cooperation, how we've mediated our existence with nature. People work together, divide tasks among themselves to meet a common goal, to ensure the safety of their community. And that's happened all throughout history. With capitalism, with the division of labor specific to capitalism, we have private individuals who produce their items in isolation. And so their production is based on speculation on whether or not their item's going to exchange on the market. When this falls short, when this speculation falls short and their commodity cannot sell, this is an interesting paradox. A use value has been produced that no one has a use for. And we can understand this as overproduction, as a failure to properly distribute the total labor and produce of society. And the division of labor necessary to commodity production and capitalism is one of the many features that kind of produces these problems of overproduction, because there's no conscious coordination as to what is being produced and how labor is distributed. And if we read further into Capital, there's other ways that Marx talks about the division of labor that are really important as well. So next up, this is going to get kind of heady, and this section of Capital is really interesting. This is from our reading. Marx dedicates a large number of pages to analyzing the development of exchange value, from the case of simple isolated acts of exchange to the general form of value, whereby through the great multitude of acts of exchange within society, the value of any one commodity can be expressed in relation to many others. So I remember reading this through this section and kind of just scratching my head the entire time. And I then I was going to try and present and explain it in depth, and realized that that's just like, I don't know, it was way too difficult. So I just wanted to try and explain Marx's method and just show how in depth and interesting this method is. So we're talking about the value form. What Marx starts with on the top left, we have the simple form of value. He started with the isolated act of exchange, right? We had the coat and 20 sheets of linen, and he used those to help us understand abstract labor, how the value of these two items is determined by how much socially necessary labor time goes into their production. Now we move to a different level of analysis. The linen on the left is now the relative form of value, while the coat is the equivalent form. So the coat's use value is disregarded. It's considered an embodiment of the linen's value. So we can just explain this as 20 yards of linen is worth one coat, or the value of linen is one coat. So this simple form on the top left, it expresses the value of linen in an object and makes it measurable, but it doesn't relate the linen to all the other commodities. It's insufficient. There's deficiencies in this. So he then moves on to the expanded form of value, which is a, quote, endless series of expressions. We have 20 yards of linen related to and every commodity, one coat, half a ton of iron, 40 pounds of coffee, etc. The list can go on endlessly. So first, we can see how in a commodity producing society with this form that these exchange ratios are not, they're not coincidental results of like two people meeting and agreeing on something. These are results of the socially necessary labor time taken to produce them. This is how they're measured, and we can see how this is expressed in excuse me, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So yeah, these exchange ratios are not coincidental. The second thing we see with this is that the linen can be expressed, the value of the linen can be expressed by any commodity, but all these expressions kind of exclude each other. This formula is kind of open-ended. It is a, quote, mosaic of disparate and unconnected expressions of value. It is also insufficient in understanding value. We don't have what Michael Heinrich calls a unified expression of value. So we then move on to the general form of value. The general relative form of value imposes the character of universal equivalent on the linen, which is the commodity excluded as equivalent from the whole world of commodities. The physical form of the linen counts as the visible incarnation of all human labor. So a commodity can only acquire a general expression of value if at the same time all other commodities express their values in the same equivalent. What we have here is the expression of value in a simple and unified form, in an objectified form. And this shows that as a necessary consequence of commodity production, socially necessary labor time asserts itself as a regulative law of, quote, nature. All these items assume a value based on the average socially necessary labor time required to produce them, and they express that value in 20 yards of linen. So this is very kind of strange and abstract. The general value form in which all the products of labor are presented as mere congealed quantities of undifferentiated human labor shows by its very structure that it is a social expression of the world of commodities. In this way, it is made plain that within this world, the general human character of labor forms its specific social character. So this general form of value that we're just looking at, it shows an expression of value in a specific social form, which is the universal equivalent. And in this case, it's 20 yards of linen. So what we can see here is that value is not an inherent property of an individual commodity. It is only through the commodity's social relation to the entire world of commodities that a commodity possesses value. So yeah, this is very strange so far. And I remember kind of being like, all right, what's Marx trying to do here? What he's doing now is investigating different form determinations or aspects of the commodity. He hasn't taken in consideration people's role in creating and maintaining these forms and social relations. And this is also not like a chronological development. This is a conceptual and scientific development containing many, many different levels of analysis. But the bottom line is we can kind of see that this general form of value doesn't really make sense in direct relation to our lives. But Marx really quickly addresses this. And he does so with the money form. And with this, when we looked at the general form of value, all Marx did was swap 20 yards of linen for 2 ounces of gold. And what happens here, and I think Michael Heinrich explained it really well, is that the equivalent form has coalesced by social custom with the specific natural form of a particular commodity. This commodity thus becomes the money commodity. So money is an independent manifestation of value. It can be used for exchange for any commodity at any time. And money has existed in other societies. You know, it's pretty logical that, you know, if a guy who makes chairs meets someone who, say a guy who makes chairs needs 10 oranges, and his chair is worth 50 oranges. Say he needs 10 oranges, he's not going to cut off a piece of his chair to exchange. He's going to sell his chair for money and then buy the amount of oranges that he needs. But in capitalism, money becomes a necessary and universal kind of form of appearance of value that really ends up kind of obscuring the social relationships, the labor and the social relationships between laborers under capitalism, and also relations of exploitation, which I don't think Marx really gets to, which he does not get to in this step of his analysis. So this brings us to the commodity fetish. This is a really heavy quote. The commodity form and the value relation of the products of labor within which it appears have absolutely no connection with the physical nature of the commodity and the material relations arising out of this. It is nothing but the definite social relation between men themselves, which assumes here, for them, the fantastic form of a relation between things. So, yeah, the commodity and value are not natural, immutable forms of human existence. These are social relations that are specific to capitalism. The commodity is at the same time a use value and a social mediation. This is how we're able or forced essentially to mediate our existence with society. So value is in no way a natural property of any object, yet we perceive it as such. This is what Marx calls commodity fetishism. And by fetishism, he's not referring to the fetish as we understand it today. He's referring to an earlier definition of it, where it's kind of defined as a fetish. It was more used in relation to like religious objects, which were considered to be imbued with magical properties. And in capitalism, we perceive the commodity, these items that we produce, as something which inherently possesses value. And the relations of production between people are served as the relations between commodities, between things. And I'm just going to do one more quote. I apologize for all the quotes, but you know me. It is, however, precisely this finished form of the world of commodities, the money form, which conceals the social character of private labor and the social relations between individual workers, by making those relations appear as relations between material objects instead of revealing them plainly. If I state that coats or boots stand in relation to linen because the latter is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, the absurdity of the statement is self-evident. Nevertheless, when the producers of coats and boots bring these commodities into relation with linen or with gold, and this makes no difference here, as the universal equivalent, the relation between their own private labor and the collective labor of society appears to them exactly in this absurd form. So, yeah, that's, I just can't express how much I love that writing. I love how all these abstractions that we read through and that we fight through in this first chapter of Capital essentially are demonstrating the absurdity of the commodity and value. But these, and that these forms and social relations, these both produce and result from a specific set of like social practices that are not historically, they're not trans-historical. They're unique to this epoch of where capitalist production is dominant. So while these things are absurd, they also have massive and real material implications in shaping and controlling our everyday lives. Marx kind of looks back on feudal society where a portion of the serf's produce was given directly to the lord, and other items that the serfs produced were immediately consumed. There was no exchange, no commodities were involved. These were overt social relations. They were characterized by the personal domination of one group over another group, and were very immediately understood by all parties involved. With capitalism, this is a quote from Moise Pistone: society is ultimately structured by a new underlying level of social interrelatedness, which cannot be adequately grasped in terms of the overtly social relations among people or groups, including classes. So, while Marx absolutely includes class in his analysis of capitalism, it's an important part of it. His ultimate goal was to understand this kind of underlying social fabric of capitalism, these underlying deep social relations. And these relations, they constitute an abstract system of impersonal domination. They're perceived by large sections of the world population as natural and immutable. By the end of volume 1, we see that this is, we can already see that it's not natural, but now we can see that it's become the dominant mode of production because through a violent and horrifically bloody process, the majority of humanity has been stripped of access to the means of production. They're left with no other option but to sell their labor power as a commodity in order to live. And so our lives are kind of shaped by manifestations of these deep contradictory social forms that Marx analyzes. And we can't immediately understand them. This is why we see mainstream economic theory. As Marxists, we understand that as just repeated attempts to rationalize the countless contradictions within capitalism. It opens up a whole kind of just that first chapter, though, going back. We can see even with this level of analysis, where we haven't even considered capital, we already run into problems and contradictions. And as Marx develops this, he demonstrates the inherently antagonistic and contradictory nature of capitalism, how these social relations regularly result in overproduction, stagnation, and crisis. He even points out the ecological implications of industrial production. But even by reading the first chapter of this book, we can begin to imagine, quote, an association of free men working with the means of production held in common and expending their many different forms of labor power as one single social force. And even in that first chapter, he begins to kind of hint at the idea of communism, and it's really beautiful. So yeah, this is a lot, and it's really, I don't know. I've spent a lot of time reading this, and I don't claim to have a very deep understanding of this, but I really love discussing it. I hope it opens up some questions for discussion. It's been really fun putting this all together. So thanks. These were the books that I kind of drew from that I've read. Michael Heinrich wrote an intro to the 3 volumes of Capital, but then he also wrote a 400-page book on the first 400 pages of Capital. Talks very much in depth about the first chapter, especially then Capital Volume 1, and then another really brilliant book by Moishe, I don't know how to pronounce it, Postone, Time, Labor, and Social Domination. And it's really, really brilliant to help me understand some stuff. So yeah, thanks, y'all. That's all I had.